I first went to Crete on the back of a moped when I was 18, and I fell in love, I have to say, not with my companion, but with the landscape and the Bronze Age Minoan culture there. It just seemed to me so extraordinary that men and women, in their minds and with their bare hands, were forging what it is to be a civilization. Crete can boast a whole number of firsts. It said that here was the first paved road in Europe, the first throne, and even the first flush toilet. We went to make the film in Crete in July, in the middle of a heat wave, and so we were filming in temperatures of around 104 degrees every day. So I have to say, rather sweatily, we followed in the footsteps of this man. He is, if you like, the Indiana Jones of Crete, Sir Arthur Evans. Evans, whose archive is kept here at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, made a series of spectacular finds at Knossos at the beginning of the 20th century. He uncovered a very strange world, but one that he thought was a high-octane, peace-loving first file on European Western civilization. Here there were extraordinary things, high priestesses who grappled with snakes, athletic men who jumped over bulls 5 feet high, and even goddesses with opium poppies in their hair. Evans was a brilliant archaeologist, but as time goes on, we realise, of course, that the story was not quite as simple as that. Crete was not Eurocentric. In fact, it looked south and to the east, to Africa and to Asia Minor for its inspiration. Also, the Minoans had a very vexed relationship with their gods. This was a time when the gods were everywhere, in the fruit on the trees, in the sky, when you made love, when you gave birth, and it was terribly important for the Minoans to keep the spirit world on side. But then Crete suffered a massive geophysical disaster. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that archaeologists are actually uncovering evidence of a very traumatised society. In this film, we go to visit a sanctuary where it seems as though a human sacrifice has been interrupted in mid-flow. We also look at these children's bones, which have been cooked, and then the flesh scraped off. So this could be evidence of cannibalism. As a historian, it felt that these were very important stories to tell, but actually as a person, they were very troubling things to deal with. So making this film rammed home two things to me. First, that however many centuries or even millennia separate you from those of the distant past, it is always possible to feel a connection with the long dead. And also it reminded me that history is not a tablet of stone. We do not know the way it was. We can just try to grope our way towards the truth. Because history is not the study of the dead, but it's the study of something which is much more unpredictable and chameleon-like. It's a study of life.
And down he went into that doleful gulf, through winding paths among the rocks, under caverns and arches and galleries. And he turned on the left hand and on the right hand till his head was dizzy. But all the while he held his clue. And when he saw him, he stopped a while, for he had never seen so strange a beast. His body was a man's, but his head was the head of a bull, and his teeth were the teeth of a lion, and with them he tore his prey. And when he saw Theseus, he roared, and he put his head down and rushed right at him.
Of all the Greek myths, the story of the labyrinth is one of the most dramatic and unforgettable. A subterranean struggle between the ultimate hero, Theseus, and the ultimate monster, the Minotaur, the offspring of an unnatural union between a woman and a bull. It was told and retold for centuries before anyone thought to write it down, by which time it had become just another great story from the back catalogue of the ancient world. But the roots of the myth go deep, to a time before history, when stories like this were the way that people made sense of themselves and their past. So where did the Greeks get the story of a flesh-eating bullman lurking in a dark, menacing labyrinth? To answer that question, you have to journey far into the past. 1,500 years before the Parthenon was built. Way before Homer's time. Back 5,000 years to an extraordinary time and place. To Bronze Age Crete and the island of the Minoans. This is Crete, birthplace of an advanced prehistoric civilization, which then disappeared so suddenly and completely. All that remained were half-remembered, half-invented fragments, the stuff of myth. There's something very seductive about the idea of a lost civilization, although it usually turns out just to have been misplaced. But when it comes to the inhabitants of Bronze Age Crete, it's remarkable to think that until just over 100 years ago, few suspected they existed. The Minotaur may have been a myth. These people were scarcely a rumour. And then, in a spectacular archaeological coup, its people, lost to history for thousands of years, were rediscovered and named the Minoans. The lure of the labyrinth has proved irresistible ever since, with a stream of tourists, grave robbers, archaeologists and historians drawn back, like me, to search for traces of the lost world of the Minoans, sometimes in the most unexpected places. The picture that emerges is equally unexpected, and the journey I'm going on now will take us to the very heart of this strange world, where sophistication and culture exist side by side with blood and terror, where beauty walks hand in hand with the beast. Crete, according to the Greeks, is Megalonisi, the big island. And compared to the other islands of the Aegean, it is a whale in a school of minnows. But it's actually not that megalo. 150 miles long and never much more than 30 miles wide, an isolated landmass floating in the middle of the Libyan and Aegean seas. What is striking, though, is the amazing variety of landscapes that Crete manages to pack into the narrow space between its shores. Enough to satisfy a continent. There are forests of pine, date palm groves skirting broad sandy beaches, and no less than 15 mountain ranges, 3 of them high enough to keep their snow well into spring. Rivers course year-round through the veins of the island, winding down deep, narrow gorges, and feeding the stalactites in endless subterranean caverns. Travel around and you understand why Crete has been such a fertile breeding ground for tales of daring do, love and sex, blood and gore. Anything seems possible here, even the incredible story of a king, his wife, and a pure white bull. According to the myth, Crete was the realm of the powerful King Minos, a scrupulous lawgiver who was also prone to that very Greek form of arrogance, hubris.
One day, to prove how far he was in favour with the gods, he prayed for a bull to be delivered to him from the sea. Poseidon very generously obliged, producing a spotless white creature, assuming, though, that Minos would do the decent thing and offer it back to him in sacrifice. But the king was too enamoured of his fine gift. He sacrificed another in its place, keeping the white bull safe in a field. A big mistake. The god was offended. Poseidon's punishment was to spark in Minos' wife Pasiphae a fierce, uncontrollable sexual longing for this beautiful white creature.
This is where the intriguing Daedalus begins to play his part in this strange story. He was the master inventor, an Athenian according to the self-regarding mainland Greeks, but working in Crete in the service of King Minos. Pasiphae knew that if anyone could find a way for her to satisfy her lust for the bull, it would be Daedalus, the Mr. Fix-It of the Bronze Age.
Never at a loss, Daedalus arranged in the squeamish Victorian version of the story for Pasiphae to interview the bull. He designed a hollow cow set on wheels with room enough for the queen inside. This pantomime creation was left in the field, and Pasiphae clambered in.
The result of the interview was the birth of the Minotaur, a hideous hybrid with the body of a man and the head and horns of a bull.
For the ancient Greeks, the Minotaur was a freak of nature. The playwright Euripides wrote of it, Sumekton eidos kaiphulion brephos, a monster child, a hybrid that has no place on earth.
And so, the story goes that Daedalus came to design a huge subterranean labyrinth to hide the shameful offspring of Minos' wife. And there, every 9 years, the tribute children, 7 youths and 7 maidens, would be brought from Athens to satiate the Minotaur's taste for human flesh. That is until the brave Theseus arrived. Minos' daughter, clever, beautiful Ariadne, was the keeper of the keys to the labyrinth, and with her help, Theseus set off to slay the beast.
You can't help wondering whether there's a grain of truth alongside all this mythical cock and bull. Whether the Athenian tribute speaks of a time when mainland Greece was under Crete's thumb, and the triumph of Theseus over the Minotaur points to the moment when the tables were turned. Of course, there was no half-man, half-bull. Perhaps there was a flesh-and-blood King Minos and a wily Princess Ariadne. You could speculate for hours, but it's not time wasted. Nothing comes from nowhere, and some of the greatest archaeological discoveries were driven by the need to know whether myths had a historical leg to stand on.
The first to test the reality of the myths was Heinrich Schliemann, 1 part pioneer archaeologist, 2 parts treasure seeker. In 1871, at Hisarlik on the coast of modern-day Turkey, he discovered what he claimed was the site of the Troy that Homer had written about. The finds were electrifying, including a spectacular hoard of jewellery that he got his wife Sophie to model for an enthralled world. It seemed that the works of Homer were history, not poetry, and the public was gripped. But Schliemann didn't rest on his laurels. He turned his attention to the other players in Homer's great epic, at Mycenae, on the Greek mainland. What Schliemann discovered there was what he believed to be the home of the Greek warlord Agamemnon. Graves just inside the city walls were opened to reveal the military trappings and wealth of the High King. Swords, daggers, cups, rings, and most famously of all, the death masks, crafted from wafer-thin, glittering gold. For some classically educated scholars, this was a real shock. For them, prehistoric civilization was a contradiction in terms. And yet, there was something undeniably civilized and sophisticated about all this stuff. But while some simply gawped at Schliemann's finds, there were others whose instinct told them that the hoard from Mycenae was just the beginning.
One of Britain's leading Egyptologists, Flinders Petrie, argued that the Mycenaeans, as they were now known, were no sudden apparition. These pottery fragments, some of his own finds from Egypt, had already got him thinking. These are 300 years older than that treasure from Mycenae. He knew they weren't Egyptian, and he had a strong hunch that they came from somewhere in the Aegean. Find the people that made these, Petrie said, and you'll find whoever it was that came before the Mycenaeans. And I bet they'll turn out to be Europe's first civilization.
The starter's pistol had been fired, and one of the greatest archaeological races of all time was up and running. Somewhere in the Aegean, there was a lost world just waiting to be found. And so in 1900, chasing the lead of Schliemann and Petrie, a 48-year-old British archaeologist with a long distinguished career behind him came to Crete, to a place called Knossos. His name was Arthur Evans, and Knossos was soon to be inextricably linked with him.
When Arthur Evans began digging here on the morning of March the 23rd, 1900, he could have given you a dozen sound archaeological reasons for picking the site. The place was littered with tantalising clues. Roman coins, pottery shards from Homer's time, ancient walls disappearing into the hillside. And then there were these exquisite prehistoric seal stones and rings that locals had been finding in the area for generations. Knossos was a site with a big label on it saying, "Excavate me."
Layer upon layer of topsoil was carried away, at first in wicker baskets by the 31-strong workforce. Then, 2 weeks later, as the size of the task dawned on Evans, by 100 men using iron wheelbarrows. And as the speed of the excavations picked up, so did the excitement. Evans sketched a plan of the emerging walls, with scrolled edges, like the pirates' maps in children's books, complete with an X to mark the spot where treasure had been found.
The buildings they were uncovering here were far bigger and more complex than anything that Troy or Mycenae had to offer. Wherever they dug, they just seemed to go on and on. Cascading staircases, twisting corridors, a bewildering complement of rooms, some small and intimate, others elegant and imposing. This was a labyrinth, but far more than just a monster's cage.
The site that Arthur Evans and his men had uncovered at Knossos surpassed the expectations of even the most optimistic hunter of the past. A 5,000-year-old civilization, previously buried in myth, had been brought blinking back into the real world. He hadn't found a city of gold, but the hoard from Knossos was even richer than that of Troy or Mycenae. The quality of the finds was extraordinary, but it wasn't just the craftsmanship that made a powerful impression. A month into the excavations, the men digging at the west entrance discovered a huge, imposing fresco fragment of a charging bull. It was life-size and lifelike, sculpted from lime plaster in high relief.
Meeting this creature head-on as it emerged from the earth was a spine-chilling experience. As one of the workmen brushed back the soil to expose its flaring nostrils and sharp horns, he screamed out in terror, believing he disturbed a demon, or worse still, the devil himself.
Evans had found his labyrinth and his bulls. All he needed now was evidence for King Minos, and the myths would be fully realised. On the 13th of April 1900, just 3 weeks after the first basket of earth had been filled, workmen began to uncover a complex of little antechambers leading into a main room behind.
On the south wall, workers unearthed a fresco fragment of a bull's hoof, and all around the room, fine gypsum benches. But it was the north wall that harboured the most exciting secret. Here, Evans uncovered something he must have dreamt about finding: an elaborately carved throne.
Harriet Boyd, a pioneering young American archaeologist, was lucky enough to be with Evans when the throne was revealed. In her journal notes, she described the moment of discovery. Intense excitement, she wrote, as a workman removed the last earth from the oldest throne in Europe, and the stone chair stood forth intact.
Evans toyed with the idea that this was the throne of Ariadne, apparently reasoning that the wide moulded seat was more suited to the ample buttocks of a woman. But before long, he was decided, and in a telegram to the Times, he announced the discovery of the throne of King Minos. The Minoans had arrived.
The discovery of the throne was the culmination of years of dreaming. Evans later said it was as though he'd been given an open sesame, and a prehistoric civilization beyond his wildest imaginings had appeared from a crack in the earth. If Knossos was indeed the seat of King Minos, he certainly had good taste in palatial pads. This was an incredible structure, and befitting one of the most powerful kings of the Bronze Age, it's built with no expense spared. At its peak, Knossos covered an area of 700,000 square metres, more than 3 times the size of Buckingham Palace and its grounds, with an approach as grand as the Mall.
If you thought the Romans had the monopoly on precision road building, then think again. This is Europe's first made road. It was constructed out of clay, cement and stones and faced with limestone slabs. You have to imagine it flanked on either side with grand houses, leading straight from the town of Knossos right up to the palace. Daedalus himself would have been proud of this elegant boulevard. It's a masterpiece of prehistoric urban design. At the risk of sounding like an estate agent, the palace boasts an impressive array of original features. Hinge doors, drainage systems, and what Evans famously described as a flush toilet. Another first for the Minoans.
Knossos is a building that adds up to more than the sum of its parts. You feel you're being taken on a journey that's been expressly designed to beguile and seduce, as well as bewilder and confuse. You find yourself in gorgeous stone-clad rooms, and then walking past rows of pithoi, man-size Alibaba jars in dark, sunken storerooms. Each of the 7 or 8 separate entrances feels like it's reserved for a different occasion. Some for privileged access, some, like here at the north entrance, for immediate, awe-inspiring impact.
But whatever route you take brings you here. the immense central court. 54 metres from north to south, 27 metres wide. The size of 4 tennis courts fitted together with room enough to spare. Clearly, this space could accommodate huge numbers of people, but no one knows what it was used for. It's a giant question mark at the heart of Knossos.
Archaeologists are still trying to solve the riddle of this enigmatic space. But the most enduring theory is also the most dramatic, that the central court was the stage for a spectacular religious ritual. This was taurokathapsia, bull leaping, and it was to Knossos what gladiatorial combat was to Rome.
There are lots of clues from Minoan art as to how these scary-sounding ceremonies would have been performed, although there's still plenty of room for interpretation, and I'm sure every seasoned bull leaper would have had his own repertoire of tricks. One possible technique, though, would have been to have grabbed the bull by its horns as it charged towards you, to be flung up onto its back as the animal tossed its head, and then somersault back down onto the ground. Whoever pulled off these crazy stunts must have been fantastically strong and supple, especially bearing in mind the sheer size of these animals, because these were crossbreed aurochs, particularly foul-tempered, standing 6 foot high at the shoulder and with a horn span to match. Aurochs have been extinct for nearly 4 centuries, so just try to imagine being in the presence of a beast whose hoofprint is the size of a man's head.
Bulls had been worshipped as symbols of fertility since the Stone Age. So perhaps bull leaping was an attempt to capture some of their elemental power. The people who did this were clearly revered, as you can see from this beautiful ivory figurine of one of the leapers. Confident and sinewy, his limbs had been elongated to emphasize his agility. For the Minoans, bull leaping was as much about self-belief as religious belief.
You should think of the bull as an honoured guest, the king of the beasts invited to the palace, an envoy from the natural world. He's here as a dancing partner, formidable and impressive, but it's still the bull leapers that are calling the tunes. These displays weren't designed to reduce the potency of the bull, but for the Minoans one thing was clear. The bull charges because that's what he does. Man leaps because he chooses to.
But it wasn't just in the bull leaping ritual that the Minoans revelled in their intimacy with the natural world. Their art is infused with the same spirit of self-confidence and daring.
It seems there was no style they wouldn't try, no materials they wouldn't use, no technique too complicated to employ. It's almost as though once the Minoans realised what humans were capable of, they couldn't stop themselves. They became addicted to creating. From ivory carving to faience beads, from fresco painting to stone sculpture, it was all done with elegance and panache.
Minoan artists took their cue from the natural world, but they weren't its slavish imitators. Nature provided the raw materials, texture, form, colour, and they felt free to play with them, to manipulate and extemporise. The hothouse culture of this island produced some fabulously exotic fruit. These eggshell-thin cups are called Kamari's ware, named after the cave where many examples were found. They are almost 4,000 years old, but they'd sit happily on the style pages of a glossy magazine. And it's not just the artefacts that seem to speak to us across the millennia. The recovery of this fresco fragment during the second season at Knossos is one of the most charming of all the stories to have come out of the dig. The visiting French scholar, when he saw the pieces being reassembled, burst out, "Mais ce sont des Parisiennes." The basic idea being that this 3,500-year-old woman wouldn't have seemed out of place strolling down the Champs-Élysées. For Evans, La Parisienne, as she became known, was the perfect Minoan. Refined, sophisticated, strangely modern, and above all, European. Right from the start, he'd believed that the prehistoric cultures of Greece and the Aegean were different from contemporary cultures of Egypt and the Middle East. Knossos and its artistic riches had only served to strengthen this impression. The culture of the Minoans, he said, expressed a free and independent spirit. Independent, that is, of the powerful pull of the other cities and kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. Evans pictured his Minoans as lords and masters of their own island culture, able to keep the rest of the world at arm's length. He came to see Minoan Crete as the place where Europe's first naissance, or birth, took place, and the culture from which all subsequent renaissance sprang. Classical Greece, Imperial Rome, even the good old British Empire itself. All of them had a trace of Minoan DNA in their genes. Evidence for what was arguably the Western world's first civilization had emerged from the earth at Knossos. How many more secrets was the rest of Crete still hiding? While Evans' worker ants continued to pick over the bones of Knossos, other archaeologists went Minoan hunting elsewhere on the island. Further along the north coast from Knossos, French archaeologists turned their attention to a site here at Marlia. And what they discovered, along with similar finds in the south, added a rich, intriguing layer of complexity to the picture that Evans had started. It soon became clear that although the palace at Knossos was a prodigy, it wasn't unique. And if Daedalus had designed it, then others had been playing copycat all over Crete.
Here at Marlia and at Festos and at Ayatriada on the south of the island, other palaces were discovered in quick succession. They're all more compact than Knossos and each has its own unique features, but they're still built to the same blueprint. Every one has its central courtyard, every one has its warren of pithoi packed storerooms, and every one has its public arena where Pallas and the people met. Suddenly, labyrinths were cropping up all over Crete.
They all clearly belonged to the same architectural family as Knossos, so they were all immediately given the same family name, Palaces. It's a tribute to the persuasiveness of Evans' vision that the name has stuck. But how appropriate is it?
You might think buildings as grand as Marlia are all the proof you need for the existence of some kind of monarchy. Why build a palace fit for a king other than to put a king in it? But then when you look for other telltale signs of a ruling dynasty, Bronze Age Crete seems surprisingly republican. Because unlike other contemporary cultures such as Egypt and the Middle East, here there are no giant awe-inspiring statues, no insignia stamping a badge of ownership on buildings and the land around them. There is only an empty throne. King Minos is conspicuous by his absence.
When Minoans are shown performing some kind of public function, they usually share the stage with others, suggesting power is also shared. No one emerges as top dog. All men seem equal, and if anything, the women seem more equal than the men. Cretan girls loom large in art and myth, not just decorative creatures, but women who appear to be prestigious and influential, custodians of their culture. But however prominent women are, the overriding atmosphere in the palaces is unexpectedly corporate and anonymous. So maybe Malia and Knossos weren't palaces at all, but places where the Minoan people came together to exercise their collective power. And as soon as you manage to put the seductive vision of kings and princesses to one corner of your mind, the possibilities are endless. What I'm reminded of when I visit the palaces are monasteries. Just imagine those powerful institutions with one foot in heaven and one foot planted very firmly in the real world. Alongside the abbeys and shrines, there were workshops and offices, turning out anything from illuminated manuscripts to potent liqueurs. The surrounding farmlands would have been worked by the people, but the fruits of their labour belonged to the monastery. The palaces, too, may have functioned as granaries for the gods and festival halls in which the harvests could be stored and the generosity of the gods honoured.
Like other Bronze Age cultures, the Minoans relied on the food that they could grow to survive. Without rich farmland, timely spring rain and the sun at harvest time, these storerooms, usually full to bursting, would have been empty and bitter with the taste of dust. Keeping on side those gods that decided whether you ate that year or died hungry was a serious business. In Egypt at this time, we know that over a third of the year, 120 days, were devoted to agricultural festivals. It's where the festival hall theory comes into its own. Perhaps these palaces were giant venues dedicated to the celebration of the island's fertility.
On this beautiful vase, you can sense both the relief and the joy in the faces of the harvesters as they carry symbolic sheaves from the fields, singing and laughing. Perhaps they're on their way to the palace to give thanks to their gods for another successful harvest. In a world of palaces and frescoes and beautiful artefacts, it's easy to overlook the ordinary Minoans, who would have been kept far too busy to worry about the finer points of bull leaping. Luckily, the archaeological riches of Crete weren't restricted to the posh end of the market. Welcome to the cheap seats. While grand buildings like Knossos and Festos were being excavated, Harriet Boyd, the American archaeologist, was exploring a site at Gorniar that has told us a huge amount about Minoan Crete beyond the palaces.
The treasures found at Gorniar were the stuff of everyday life. Fish hooks, carpenter's saws, potter's wheels, all a far cry from the stair-tied vessels and the ivory figurines of the palaces. And yet it was populations like these that made the Minoan world go round. It was their ambitious craftsmanship that produced those objects, their industry that put food on the table for the kings or priestesses or whoever it was that lived at places like Knossos. In a society that was so productive, everyone had their role to play. And if the gods had been kind and the harvests were plentiful, you can imagine the men and women of Gorniar enjoying life in their flourishing market town.
We can even visualise the kind of homes the inhabitants of Gorniar might have lived in. This 3,000-year-old clay model of a house is amazingly detailed. It seems that the houses had no more than 5 small rooms on the ground level, basements for storage, and an open, flat roof. No doubt the prime spot to get some relief from the heat and increase the chances of a good night's sleep.
Most of the houses at Gorniar would have been white, just like the picture postcard Greek villages of today. But fresco evidence suggests that some of the wealthier homes would have been given a subtle colour wash. The palette was taken direct from the landscape, and the pigments would have come straight out of the earth. Yellow ochres and red oxides that would have given you everything from a delicate pink to a rich chocolate brown. I'd have loved to have seen Gornia back then, the watercolour painting clinging to its hillside, looking out across the sea.
By the end of the 1920s, Minoan civilization, from the poshest of palaces to the humblest fisherman's cottage, had come a long way from being lost. But whatever extra details archaeologists like Boyd added, the master plan belonged to Evans. He'd been the first to enter the labyrinth. He'd given the Minoans their name, defined the qualities that made them unique, and in his multi-volume book, The Palace of Minos, he'd even sketched out a plausible history for them, from their sudden rise to their equally dramatic collapse. Around 1450 BC, as Evans saw it, the Palace of Knossos had emerged victorious from a bitter, island-wide civil war that had left the rest of Crete in flaming ruins. Even in their moment of destruction, it seemed, the fate of the Minoans lay in their own hands, free from outside influences.
Arthur Evans was a brilliant archaeologist, and he was a showman. His version of the Minoans was made up of spade work, observation, intuition, and flights of fancy. If you enter the labyrinth, you're just as likely to meet him at its heart as you are the Minotaur. But since his death, new generations of archaeologists have uncovered fresh evidence that tells a rather different story.
When Arthur Evans died, the jigsaw puzzle of Minoan Crete appeared to have been completed, apart from one piece that he never found a place for. Alongside the beautiful frescoes and vases, what he discovered at Knossos were thousands of small clay tablets covered in different kinds of writing. He saw endless possibilities running across their marked surfaces. If he could just decipher them, he'd break a silence that had lasted for thousands of years. Evans named these different scripts, rather prosaically, Linear A and Linear B, and he was convinced that they were examples of a unique Minoan language, one that would prove beyond all doubt the Minoans' superior status as an independent island nation. In other words, Evans could give the Minoans their history. The problem was that he couldn't make sense of the tablets, and he died before he could drag his Minoans out of the prehistoric world. It wasn't until after his death that other scholars could get their hands on the evidence and study the tablets in depth. Even then, it took years for anyone to break the code. And when someone did, the archaeological world was in for a bit of a shock. When Michael Ventris heard Evans lecture as a schoolboy, he'd become driven by the desire to recover what he too was convinced was the lost language of the Minoans. But after years of hard labour, he announced in 1952 that what he'd been struggling with wasn't Minoan at all, but a difficult and archaic form of Greek, the language spoken by the Mycenaeans, the Greek warlords from the mainland. So suddenly, the great fires of 1450 BC began to make more sense. Maybe they weren't the result of a Minoan civil war, but evidence for a wholesale Mycenaean takeover in Crete, with the mighty Knossos left intact to become the invaders' headquarters. And when you think about it, it's not surprising that the aggressive Mycenaeans wanted to stake their claim to Crete. For 1,000 years, the Minoans had been showing the rest of the Bronze Age world how to make a serious success of things. That's admiration and envy building up over 40 generations. What eventually made the Minoans vulnerable to a Mycenaean coup is still the subject of heated archaeological debate. But however they got here, it seems they were here. Johnny-come-latelys, usurping control for the last 200 years of a civilization that had been up and running for thousands.
The Mycenaeans took up the trappings of Minoan culture with relish and no little respect, but inevitably they changed things. This tomb is of a type entirely new to the island, the monument of a warrior culture, a fortified treasure house, here to assert clan prestige and individual honour, alien concepts to the Minoans.
Once the scholars had got over the shock of Ventris's decipherment, the people were hungry to discover what Linear B could tell them about the kind of place Minoan Crete had become under the rule of the Greeks from Mycenae.
The tablets turned out to be the contents of a Bronze Age filing cabinet, a meticulous record of the business end of palace life.
This one deals with a shepherd called Poros and details his flock.
We know that he had 28 rams and 72 ewes. It's an extraordinary thought that every itinerant herdsman up on the hillside was being monitored by the bean counters in the palace down below.
It's not a grand history, but it still short-circuits you straight into the lives of the people. There are references to bronzesmiths, bakers and farmers, and even the individual names of oxen: dusky, noisy and spotty. We also get a glimpse of loftier beings, some of the gods and goddesses worshipped at places like Knossos.
A number of the tablets record offerings to the religious powers. Here, there are 2 litres of olive oil offered to Pipituna, an early Minoan goddess. Down here you can see that there are 12 given to all the other gods, and the lucky priestess of the winds gets 36. Clearly, worship had its bureaucratic side too. The decipherment of Linear B is one of the most significant breakthroughs of Bronze Age archaeology. But Linear A still remains a stubborn mystery. Most experts reckon this is the unique Minoan language that Evans was searching for. And if the work that's being done on it ever does succeed, it could unlock as many secrets as the richest of Crete's excavations.
Evans's version of the Minoans, once apparently so complete and satisfying, had begun to unravel with the decipherment of Linear B, and other troubling new evidence soon followed. Far from not leaving any Cretan stones unturned, it was becoming clear that the first generation of Minoan archaeologists had only scratched the surface. This is Anima Spilia, the Cave of the Winds, a small sanctuary about half an hour's drive from Knossos. In the 1970s, a discovery was made here that changes perceptions of who the Minoans were and the world in which they lived. Around 1700 BC, the building collapsed, at a time when the whole of Crete was devastated by earthquakes. It was this island-wide disaster that seems to have brought an abrupt halt to a gruesome rite that was taking place here.
Over there was the skeleton of a boy, aged between 17 and 18, lying on his side on some kind of an altar. His body was trussed up, and on his bones had been laid a bronze dagger. The weapon, presumably, that had cut his carotid artery, because this young man had bled to death before the buildings collapsed. Behind him was a woman lying face down, and out here, another body, someone carrying a vessel full of some kind of liquid. Most likely the fresh blood of the sacrifice being taken into the central room and offered to the deity there. Inside there was one more corpse, a man lying face up next to the sacrificial victim, aged between about 47 and 48, taller than average, and on the little finger of his left hand, a ring made of silver and iron. Back in the Bronze Age, iron was exotic and highly prized, so this was someone of high status. The priest, perhaps, who was conducting the sacrifice as the walls came tumbling down. People are still upset by what was found here and try to draw other conclusions from the archaeological and forensic evidence. Human sacrifice, even in a time of such grave crisis, flies in the face of everything that seems sophisticated and urbane about the Minoans. Dubbed Europe's first civilization, it's a shock to find that their sensibilities weren't necessarily in tune with our own. But the ancient Greeks wouldn't have been shocked. When they told stories of Crete, 1,000 years after the sacrifice at Anemispilia, they were dark and bloody. For them, this wasn't just the workshop of Daedalus, the court of King Minos and Ariadne. This was the Minotaur's realm, the man-eating monster whose dark labyrinth was the foundation on which all those glittering palaces stood.
Minoan Crete continues to fascinate, I think, precisely because of the contradictory nature of the place. But where should we look for the origins of this unique culture? And what influences fed its growth? Perhaps because he was an English gentleman at a time when his own little island dominated the globe, Arthur Evans seemed content with the notion that his Minoans were a largely self-created and self-contained phenomenon, what he called a free and independent people, flourishing on their own island home. But the days of an empire on which the sun never sets are long gone, and slowly but surely the new discoveries have helped to transform our understanding of the Minoans, enriching Evans' first draft with fascinating layers of complexity. Much of the new work has looked beyond the shores of Crete itself to the wider world of the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age. And one thing has now become very clear. From their origins 5,000 years ago to their dramatic collapse some 2,000 years later, the Minoans were intimately connected by the sea to the outside world, rather than separated by it. Island races have the reputation for being a little arrogant and self-absorbed. But in Minoan times, if you wanted not just to survive, but to build a civilization, you had to reach out across the horizons to make new connections. The Minoans were islanders, but they weren't insular. Many good things came to Bronze Age Crete by way of the sea, the raw materials from which the Minoans fashioned their civilization. But the sea also brought bad things, natural catastrophes and man-made calamities. And as the latest archaeological research has revealed, it would be a combination of sea-borne disasters that would cause the final demise of the entire Minoan people. This is Moklos, a tiny humpbacked island moored off the north coast of Crete. If you want to understand how the sea shaped the destiny of Minoan civilization, this is the place to come. Moklos was first settled 5,000 years ago, and so belongs to the very beginning of the Minoan story. This busy town's prosperity depended above all on its port, the gateway that connected it to the wider world of the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean.
Just 3 weeks sailing could land the exotic wares of Egyptian merchants from the south on these shores. Next stop east is Cyprus, and beyond that, the Old Testament ports of Tyre, Byblos and Sidon. Head due north and you hit the Greek mainland and the great ancient city of Mycenae. This was a prehistoric trade centre and provided welcome dry land and a good meal for the travelling salesman of the sea. Little wonder that Crete has been called a stepping stone for the continents.
From the very beginning, the Minoans ventured out into the world beyond their shores because they lacked the material that defined their age: bronze. An alloy of copper and tin, bronze is amazingly versatile. You can use it to make anything, from a precision stone cutter to an 8-foot two-man saw. It was to the Minoans what the microchip is to us, the technology on which the progress of their civilization depended. Thanks to its geographical position, close to the more advanced cultures of the Middle East, the secrets of bronze manufacture came early to Crete. It was probably introduced by migrants from Cilicia, present-day Turkey, some 5,000 years ago, 1,000 years before it arrived in Britain. Though they weren't natives, these settlers can claim to be the first Minoans, an advance guard from the future whose arrival put Crete one step ahead in the civilization stakes. But without regular supplies of copper and tin, Minoan Crete was in danger of slipping back into the Stone Age. There was only one option: to take to the seas.
The ancient Greeks would have assumed that a legendary king like Minos would have had a powerful fleet at his disposal to see off pirates, to intimidate his neighbours, to bring in supplies for his population when necessary. But in the Bronze Age, this is what sea power was. This is a replica of a boat that went down off the coast of Turkey. It would have had just one sail, room enough for about 24 oarsmen, and it was made of a thin lattice of cypress wood with a cloth skin. In effect, it's nothing more than a giant kayak. But it was frail little vessels like this that headed off, often into hostile waters, packed with goods for barter and exchange, stitching together the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean.
When they set sail in search of copper and tin, the Minoans became players on the world stage. One of the frustrating things about them is the fact that they've left us little or nothing in the way of written records. But that doesn't mean that they left no historical trace. The cultures they came in contact with knew them and recorded them too.
Think yourself back to some time in the middle of the 15th century BC. Imagine you're leaving Crete and boarding an Aegean trading vessel heading south to Egypt. After just 21 days travelling, you arrive at the Nile. there, you pick up a barge and continue your journey to Thebes. And when you arrive, you're presented with a picture of the Minoans that's very different from the one painted by Arthur Evans.
In the Valley of the Kings is the tomb of Rekhmire, a high-powered Egyptian bureaucrat. The tomb offers us a snapshot of the people who fell within Egypt's sphere of influence. The people of Punt, or Ethiopia, carry incense trees and animal hides. The Cushites from Nubia have ivory and gold. The retinues from Syria have pots and carts. And this delegation is described as the people of Keftiu. But from what they're carrying, we recognise them as Minoans.
The tomb of Rekhmire forces you to rethink your mental map, starting with the names. Keftiu rather than Minoans, since that seems to be the name that the Bronze Age Cretans used to describe themselves. And rather than thinking of Crete as a southeastern birthplace of Europe, we should think of it as a northwesterly extension of what we now call the Middle East. To understand the world of the Keftiu, you have to remember Egypt. Its huge temples, its elaborate religious rituals, its animal-headed gods. You have to bear in mind the Crete that appears in the Old Testament, described as the land of the Kaftor. Think of those first cities in the Euphrates Valley where urban life began. Bureaucracy, town planning, writing, where bulls and bull-headed men were central to religious cult. Elements of all these civilizations resurface in Crete, but transformed by the potent alchemy of the Minoans.
Judging from the Cretan products on display in Rekhmire's tomb and from other evidence, the Minoans specialised in the production of the desirable rather than the strictly useful. Deluxe pottery, cosmetics, fancy metalwork, and, in one recorded case, a pair of fine leather boots. They made a name for themselves by taking everyday objects and giving them an unmistakable Minoan spin, doing to the products of the Bronze Age what the Japanese would later do to electronics. But there was one luxury product above all on which the reputation of this remarkable island workshop would have rested. And it started life under the sea.
This charmless little mollusk is a murex, a sea snail that feeds off rotting flesh, hence the disgusting smell that you're very lucky not to be experiencing directly. But the Minoans recognised its true potential. They could extract something from this that was worth its weight in silver.
It was known simply as purple, a textile dye. If bronze meant sinew and muscle, purple meant glamour, status and wealth. It was quite simply one of the ancient world's most desirable commodities.
The Roman author Pliny described the purple of purples as being the colour of congealed blood. This was imperial purple, reserved for heroes and emperors. The Athenian Aeschylus wrote poetry about it. Polleis pupuras is agiron kerkida, purple ooze, precious as silver.
In classical times, The eastern city port of Tyre was recognised as the source for this precious dye. But recent archaeological work suggests that centuries before, the Minoans might well have pioneered the production of purple. Archaeologists working here at the port of Komos found hundreds of murex dating back to the early Minoan period, many of them with a tiny, precise hole in the shell. Now, this hole isn't man-made, but mollusk-made. In the wild, the murex is a predator as well as a scavenger, hunting down other forms of shellfish, boring into them and then sucking out the insides. The murex here at Komos seem to have had a taste of their own medicine, attacked by their own kind in a mass act of cannibalism. Now, when creatures behave like that, it suggests they're living uncomfortably close to each other. What you might have here is some form of factory farming. Mass production makes sense when you realise it took 12,000 murex to create enough dye to colour the hem of a single garment. Purple would have made the Bronze Age Cretans brand leaders at the luxury end of the Eastern Mediterranean trade. This rare, highly transportable commodity allowed them to exploit not just the needs, but the desires of their age. Every time a Cretan trader sealed a deal at the port of Tyre or the markets of Mycenae, the reputation of the Keftiu and their legendary island would have been magnified. But it wasn't just products that were crossing the seas. People were too. All over the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age, artists, architects and craftsmen were on the move, lent out on a regular basis by rulers keen to impress on other foreign powers the sophistication and calibre of their workforce. Now, once you get creative workers travelling around, people with greedy eyes and a natural curiosity, the possibilities for the cross-pollination of cultures, the interplay of ideas, becomes very real, which might just explain the appearance of something entirely new to Crete, the palace. The arrival of these extraordinary and enigmatic buildings, 1,000 years or so after the introduction of bronze to the island, marks another significant milestone in the evolution of Minoan culture. So far, palaces have been identified at Knossos and Malia on the north coast, at Zakros in the east, and here at Festos in the south. And archaeologists reckon they're on the scent of 2 or 3 more. Each has its own individual features, but they're all variations on the same basic theme of the labyrinth. But who wrote the original? Evidence suggests that around this time, migrant textile workers from Minoan Crete may have been active in Egypt, in which case it's possible that while they were there, they could have indulged in a bit of architectural espionage. The Cretans weren't the first to have a labyrinth. It's thought that honour belongs to the Egyptian kings, who built a maze-like tomb near Crocodipolis, the city of crocodiles. The Egyptian labyrinth no longer exists, but it was described by an awestruck Herodotus, the Greek historian who paid it a visit sometime in the 5th century BC. Of its endless rooms and corridors and chambers, he wrote, "Metona anthropeon ergon." It's hard to believe that this is the work of men. If someone familiar with the architectural triumphs of classical Greece was impressed, imagine the impact such a structure would have had when it was first built, around 1800 BC, when the wonders of the world were fewer in number. 1,500 years before Herodotus, you can imagine Cretan migrant workers coming back home as fired up as he was, full of stories about a building that baffled the senses and left the visitor awestruck. And as they were building their own masterpieces, perhaps they held that image of the Egyptian labyrinth in their minds. might have been wiser for the Minoans to study structural engineering rather than honing their fancy design skills, because Crete is earthquake country. The stamping ground of the bull god Poseidon, whose groans and bellows from deep within the earth herald imminent disaster. Around 1700 BC, 200 years after they were built, the first palaces were destroyed in a series of devastating earthquakes. If pleasing the gods was part of the reason for building them, the gods didn't stay pleased for long. It says a lot for the resilience of the Cretans that within 50 years of the calamity, they'd built new palaces on the site of the old ones, bigger and better than those that had been destroyed. But alongside the palaces, a new kind of building began to appear in this period that is just as telling about the kind of place Minoan Crete had become. Country villas, like this one at Vathipetro, surrounded now as it would have been 3,500 years ago by its own vineyards.
Crete in the Bronze Age was often a troubled and unstable place, rocked by natural disasters and not immune to man-made ones either. But if you'd been able to come here, to Vathipetro around 1600 BC, you would have tasted the good life. Because this was the Minoan Golden Age. The gods were on form, the island was behaving itself. You could have relaxed a little, enjoyed the fruits of your civilization.
Minoan palaces have been compared to medieval monasteries, which would make Vathipetro and the other places like it the equivalent of stately homes, the big house for the surrounding area. The main building would have been 2, possibly 3 stories high, with some fine rooms on the east side, perfect for taking in the morning sunshine. In the courtyard was a shrine, and around the back, extensive workshops, so this would have been a hive of activity in its day. But the house's most intimate connection was with the land, the fields of grain, the olive trees, and the vines.
This is where Vathipetro's grapes would have been brought to this fantastically well-preserved Minoan wine press. This is winemaking at its absolute simplest. You'd have put your grapes in there, kicked off your sandals, clambered in, and started to tread. This region still produces good wine, so it's quite possible that back then Vathipetro was the toast of the island.
But perhaps the most significant thing about Vathipetro is what you don't see here.
Despite the wealth of Vathipetro and of other country villas dotted around the island, there's no evidence of any kind of fortification. Now, that's significant. In the same period, over on the Greek mainland, Mycenaean warlords, the forefathers of the generation who would go on to fight the Trojan War, were holed up in fortress palaces, often built on rocky heights, divorced from the settlements down below, strongholds from which they could dominate and into which they could retreat. Here in Minoan Crete, a different spirit prevailed. 7 or 8 generations would have known an island of huge palaces, busy towns, prosperous ports, and fine villas set in a peaceful agricultural heartland. A country at ease with itself.
But this stable, sophisticated world existed on a knife edge. Within 30 years of being built, Vathipetro suffered its first, but not its last, earthquake damage. So the world for the Minoans must often have seemed a perilous and frightening place, governed by potent, sometimes vindictive powers who couldn't be understood, only placated.
This is the presiding spirit of Minoan Crete in its golden age, its icon and its pin-up girl, the snake goddess. Together with her more diminutive companion, often called the votary, she was discovered by Arthur Evans at Knossos. Evans noted rather primly in his journals her matronly bosom, before going on to describe the quality of the piece, comparing it to the best Meissen porcelain.
The goddess and her votary make a handsome duo, with their fancy, fashionable clothes, their makeup and their jewellery. But all the fine craftsmanship in the world can't disguise the fact something elemental and wild is going on here.
The goddess's fierce, wide-eyed stare is matched by her votary's rapt concentration. And that gigantic snake, it must be between 8 and 10 feet long, grips her in a protective embrace from her slender waist right up to the tip of her headdress. For all her glamour and sexual power, this is a goddess that feeds off respect and fear, not love.
The precise details of Minoan beliefs and rituals have been lost, but tantalising clues remain in seal stones and signet rings, widely used in Minoan Crete as stamps of ownership and identity, and even, it's been speculated, the Bronze Age equivalent of a credit card. Close-up examination of these finely carved artefacts reveals a ritual world of chanting and singing, ecstatic dancing, as well as the famous bull leaping. And playing a leading role throughout are what are clearly female priestesses. For some, these dominant women are proof that the mother goddess was worshipped in Minoan Crete. The cult of this supreme female deity is said to have its roots back in the Stone Age, predating by tens of thousands of years the male-dominated pantheon of gods that we're more familiar with. The mother goddess was said to have authority over everything that really mattered, from the fertility of crops and animals to the movement of the planets. She ruled over life and death, from womb to grave.
The existence of one top female god is pretty hotly disputed these days. What seems much more likely is that the island was crammed with a whole host of nature goddesses, each with her own particular area of responsibility, bringing the rain, ripening the corn, keeping those terrifying earthquakes in check. The priestesses were their earthly representatives and may even have had some kind of economic control over the exploitation and distribution of their bounty, a powerful position to be in. But you have to remember in the Bronze Age that man's relationship with nature was much more about negotiation than exploitation. When it took just 2 bad harvests to wipe out your entire food supplies, you'd have been a fool to take Earth's plenty for granted. So, led by their elegant priestesses, the Minoans would have spent a great deal of time and energy wooing and placating the powers that be.
It's long been assumed that the palaces played a key role in the religious rites of Minoan Crete. But there were other kinds of religious experience on offer. Less polished, perhaps, but just as intense. On mountain peaks, in secret palace shrines, deep in sacred caves, narcotics would have played a part in consummating the Minoans' relationship with their gods, bringing them closer to those elusive powers that controlled their lives. One effigy of a blank-eyed goddess has the seed heads of poppies in her diadem, already split open, waiting for the opium to be extracted. A cave like this is eerie and otherworldly enough as it is. You can hear the stalactites growing, faces and figures leap out at you from the rocks. Just imagine what visions you'd have seen if you'd shared in the mind-altering gift of the goddess.
Scotino is a place where religious experience would have been raw and intense, where faith was dosed with fanaticism, where followers became true believers. But what happened to those true believers when things started to go wrong? When the deities in whom they'd invested so much suddenly appeared no longer to care? The Minoans were soon to find out. After more than 1,500 years of spectacular progress, something very bad indeed happened to the Minoans in Crete. Sometime around 1450 BC, from Vathipetro to Moklos, from Festos to Malia, towns, ports, country houses and palaces all went up in flames. All, that is, except for the preeminent palace, Knossos.
At Hagia Triada, you can still see the scorch marks of the fire that raged here 3,500 years ago. This was a storeroom packed with pithoi, those giant Alibaba jars, each of which could hold 40 gallons of highly flammable olive oil. When this place went up, it was the Bronze Age equivalent of a fire in an oil refinery. The heat was so intense that the stone floor has vitrified, turned to glass. The thing about the fire here and the fires at all the other sites is that these were no accident. At Zakros, a little palace in the far east of the island, someone even went to the trouble of sawing off the necks of the pithoi so that the oil could ignite more easily. But what could have provoked these carefully planned acts of arson? And what lay behind this island-wide catastrophe?
The cataclysm that would engulf Minoan civilization and pave the way for its ultimate destruction started here, 70 miles north of Crete, on an island called Thera. Thera is the southernmost of the Greek Cycladic islands, perfectly placed to act as a middleman for the trade routes that ran north from Crete to the Greek mainland and across to the coasts of Asia Minor. The Therans weren't Minoans, but they were under the spell of Minoan culture. Their pottery, their houses, their way of life all followed a pattern set by the big island to the south.
Thera had grown fat on the profits of Bronze Age haulage, but its prosperity was built on shaky foundations, because the island of Thera is one big volcano.
At some point around 1530 BC, the island began to stir. First came a series of earthquakes, so severe that most of the towns had to be abandoned. But the gods were just getting warmed up. A few months later, things got really nasty. Ten times more powerful than the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii, 4 times greater than Krakatoa, the eruption of Thera was a true cataclysm. A third of the island's landmass, some 30 million cubic meters of hills and fields and towns, was tossed 20 miles into the air or slipped into the sea. The rest was buried beneath a blanket of ash and stones to a depth of 40 meters. It's just 70 miles from Thera's crater to the north coast of Crete, and so the Minoans had ringside seats for the death of their island neighbour. First they would have heard the earth tremors, distant, unmistakable, and all too horribly familiar. Mother Nature throwing another tantrum. But after the tremors, something new and disturbing. A dark stain spreading over the northern horizon, the volcano stoking itself up for the grand finale. And when the eruption finally came, it would have been like an atom bomb going off, the afterglow visible from Crete's peak sanctuaries. But the gods weren't finished yet. Now it was the Minoans' turn to feel their anger. Centuries later, a Roman traveller was eyewitness to the after effects of seismic activity in this part of the world. He described how the sea hauled itself back from the shore, leaving, in the abyss of the deep, sea creatures stuck fast in the slime. It must have been a ghastly and unnatural sight, but it was merely a prelude to what happened just minutes later.
At first, a low, distant roar, growing louder all the time, and then a wall of water racing towards you at the speed of an express train. The impact of the tsunami following Thera varied across the northern coast of Crete. In some places, there were waves between 10 and 20 feet tall. Impressive enough. But here at Moklos, it's estimated that they reached 100 feet high. That's higher than the island itself. It would have swamped the town, plucking boats out of the sea and spewing them up far inland.
The eruption of Thera is one of those epoch-making catastrophes that can change the course of human history. But for the Minoans, this wasn't apocalypse now. The effects of Thera on Crete would be played out over a period of some 90 years. Not a sudden execution, but a slow, painful death. After the tidal wave would have come the ash clouds, blotting out the sun, smothering the fields, poisoning water supplies, suffocating plants and animals. The effects would have varied across the island, with the east the worst hit. But farming in the Bronze Age was a fragile affair, and it wouldn't have taken much to jeopardise the harvest. If the effects of Thera were as profound as many believe, widespread famine would have marked the beginning of a long and troubled era for Crete. Ultimately, it would pave the way for the violent climax of 1450 BC, when Triada and other major centres of Minoan power went up in flames. Close to the palace of Knossos, A discovery has been made that could cast some light on conditions in Minoan Crete following the Theran catastrophe.
Archaeologists found a jumble of human bones scattered around a late Minoan house. The remains have been identified as belonging to at least 4 children, aged between 8 and 10. They seem to have been in good health when they died. Their flesh has been sliced away from the bone. You can see the cut marks here. The method is identical to that which Minoans used for carving sheep. Some of the remains were found in a cooking pot, along with the shells of edible snails. For many archaeologists, this is direct evidence of cannibalism, whether for ritual purposes or simply because the Minoans were starving.
In the aftermath of Thera, a search for scapegoats seems highly likely. And it wasn't just humans who might have been on the receiving end of people's anger. When the snake goddess and her follower were discovered at Knossos, they'd been broken into pieces before being interred in an underfloor vault. Perhaps this was how the Minoans negotiated the delicate business of decommissioning a once powerful deity whose protective force had apparently deserted her, carefully disposing of her like radioactive waste. With the old gods in disgrace, this was a heaven-sent opportunity for new cults and new gods to assert their claims. Around this time, a new style of decorative pottery appears, with a gallery of creatures from the slimy deep. According to some, this suggests a shift of focus away from the earth and towards the sea, which had just revealed with awesome emphasis its destructive powers. So was this how the sophisticated and apparently stable Minoan civilization collapsed? Not blown apart by a natural disaster, but undermined by wars of religion that followed the cataclysm. A recent discovery may hold a tantalizing clue to the forces that would finally tear Minoan civilization apart.
I think this has to be one of the most poignant and beautiful artifacts to have been discovered in Crete. He's called a kouros, which means a boy. He would have been decorated with rock crystal and gold, and his body is made of hippopotamus ivory. The choice of that material, which was valuable and exotic, combined with his stance, which is sublime, yet with a quiet power, suggests that what we have here is no mere boy. This is a boy god.
The quality of the workmanship is simply staggering. The veins, arteries, sinews and bones, rendered with an almost fanatical realism.
But of course, what strikes you first about the figure is its desecration. Those scorched, blackened limbs, the face sliced off, reminiscent of a Catholic saint in the English Reformation. And this boy has been symbolically and physically emasculated. His genitals are torn away. Despite his perfection, or perhaps because of it, this young god provoked in someone a passionate hatred.
The remains were found in Palakastro, an important Minoan town at the eastern end of Crete. The litter of burned fragments was scattered around a purpose-built shrine in which the kouros would have been displayed. When the shrine was first excavated, the telltale signs of fire damage soon appeared. But this was no ordinary fire. Like the one at Aya Triada, it was started deliberately. In fact, the fire's ferocity was intensified by blocking up doorways to create a through draft, like a blast furnace. The result was a kind of controlled explosion that tore the place apart. Then the attackers turned their attention to the Kouros.
The Kouros was snatched from the sanctuary, broken at its base, and then smashed face first against this doorpost. Its head, its neck and one of its arms flew off a couple of yards over there. Its torso and its remaining arm fell where I'm standing. Its hair, which would have been made of finely wrought gold filaments, was carried off on the wind generated by the fire. And finally, its legs, which had served as a convenient handhold, were tossed back into the sanctuary, where they burnt at temperatures of over 1,800 degrees.
When times get tough, even the most outward-looking cultures can turn in on themselves. And despite the long Minoan tradition of artistic innovation, the social dislocation caused by Thera may have brought more fundamentalist instincts to the surface. Maybe there was something about the Kouros that was just too new, too alien. To some, it may have seemed a graven image or a foreign god. But perhaps the greatest affront was that this was a male god.
There may never have been a single mother goddess in Crete, but what's certain is that female goddesses and priestesses were highly visible and possibly even dominant. So what it seems to me is that the Kouros represents a breakaway cult. Following the spectacular failure of the goddesses to protect Crete after Thera, they were demoted, and the honours usually afforded to them appropriated by what had previously been a minor male god. So what happened here at Palacastro could perhaps have been the revenge of scorned women against an upstart boy.
A religious war is only one of a number of theories that might explain why so many Minoan centres were destroyed sometime around 1450 BC.
All we do know for sure is that by then, Greek-speaking Mycenaeans from the mainland were installed at Knossos. Whether they came as conquerors or simply stepped in to pick up the pieces isn't clear. But they were, in many ways, the last Minoans, rebuilding some of the ports and palaces that had been destroyed, putting the island back on its feet. For the next 2 centuries, the fortunes of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were inextricably linked. According to Homer, one of the largest contingents of ships for the Mycenaean assault on Troy came from Crete. But if the islanders shared in the triumphs of the mainlanders, they would also share their fate. Around 1200 BC, Mycenaean power on the Greek mainland was destroyed. Massive tribal movements, slave revolts, civil war have all been blamed. But whatever it was that did for the Mycenaeans, it didn't confine itself to the mainland. Sooner or later it crossed the sea and found its way to Crete. The remnant of Minoan civilization was forced to take refuge in remote mountain hideouts like this one, Carfi. When we talk about the death of a civilization, it conjures up apocalyptic visions, tinged with flames and blood. But for the Minoans, the end came creeping in like a chill mist. In this bleak and inhospitable landscape, the final chapter of their amazing history would be written.
Those refugees who first made their way up here in the troubled 12th century BC must have found very little to love about Carthi. No bull leaping or ecstatic dancing here. Just time to watch the clouds roll into the Lasithi plateau and spot the vultures circling in the skies overhead. And all the while anxiously scanning the horizon for any signs that the cataclysm which had enveloped the coast was feeling its way up to this mountainside hideout. We
We will never know for sure exactly why the Minoans abandoned their palaces and set out for places like Carthy. But what I think you can say with absolute certainty, standing here on the edge of the world, is that the people who came here were very, very scared. So scared that it would take 100 years before they dared to venture back down to the lowlands.
New series starting this week on Channel 4 when a celebrity suffers borderline offence in the hot seat. All tongue-in-cheek, mind you. Sharon Osbourne, a comedy roast tomorrow from 10. Next here, Digging Durham. Time Team.